Hello, welcome to 陌上 USA Show. Mr. Tom Haber developed systems for neutralizing rockets and drones. He currently coaches teenager robotic teams. They met in the MIT Free Speech Alliance. Good morning, Mr. Haber.
Morning, Dr. Liu. Today, we're going to talk about the M1 tank and its implications for Ukraine. But, like I said in the last meeting, it's always best to start at the beginning. So, we're going to start with tank warfare in general and then bring it up to the M1 tank and Ukraine. What happened was that in World War I, weapons development overtook the tactics of the time. And so what happened was that the German line and the Allied force line dug into great trenches that extended all the way from the North Sea down to Switzerland. And it was almost impossible to dig these people out because now they had two things that hadn't been prevalent in prior wars. They had machine guns and they had indirect fire artillery. And so in between the two trench lines was no man's land. So here's a picture of what no man's land looked like. This used to be a forest. But after the two sides shot at each other for several years with artillery and machine guns, look at this. And so it was impossible for anyone, any foot soldier or any cavalry to cross between the two lines and overrun the other side's lines. So it was a stalemate in Europe. So they had to come up with a way to cross that area that would be impervious to machine gun fire and artillery shrapnel, and also that could cross the barbed wire barriers and the trenches that existed on either side. So they tried a number of things, but eventually they came up with a contraption that looked like this. This is the British Mark IV tank. And you can see it doesn't look too much like the tanks of today, but it had what it needed. It had tractor treads that would allow it to cross over very uneven ground. It had machine guns here and on the other side, and it was long, and it could traverse the ground and fend off machine gun fire and artillery fragments, and it was sufficient. It wasn't quite good enough to actually cross the trenches in most cases. Here's an example of what could happen with that. But it did get them to the trenches, and the machine guns allowed them to clear out enough of the enemy forces in the trenches to allow the foot soldiers to cross over. And it was sufficient to break through the trench lines. And that tank was introduced in the spring of 1918. And by fall of 1918, the war was over. So this attracted a lot of attention from military planners who realized that they had a new thing on their hands. And so all of the powers began rapid development of new types of tanks. The Germans had initially the Panzer and later on the Tiger tanks. This is a Tiger tank, which is a rather evolved tank. The initial Panzers were not nearly as formidable. They had 37 millimeter guns, the same as this French S-35 tank. But these are all in the period after World War I, but before World War II. So this is what they went into World War II with. The British had a cruiser tank, and the Russians had a very successful tank, T-34. So this is basically what World War II was fought with. And you can see that they all evolved over similar lines. They got away from the large chassis with machine guns on the side. They all have Caterpillar tractor type tread, about 5 or 6 road wheels, and a revolving turret with a gun of some size. And these designs evolved rapidly through the war. When we got into the war, we brought the M4 Sherman tank, shown here, with a 75 millimeter gun, which was a pretty good gun for that era. Towards the end, though, the Soviets decided that they needed a tank that could dominate the battlefield, that would be the king of the battlefield for years. And so they invented the T-54 tank with a 100 millimeter gun. And the Soviet tank designers had an interesting philosophy. They said, use plenty of guns. So that's what they did. And so this tank was the king of the battlefield while it rained. There were actually, this was the most produced tank in history. There were 100,000 of these tanks made, including all the variants. So we were kind of in trouble. So in 1948, the U.S. came out with the M48 Patton tank with a 90 millimeter gun, which was a pretty good tank, but probably not really sufficient to take on the T-54. So we got busy and we came up with a bigger gun. So here's the M60 tank, which was introduced by the U.S. in 1959 with a 105 millimeter gun. Aha, we got them. We beat the Russians. We have a gun that's bigger than theirs. Well, not so fast. In 1962, the Russians introduced the T-62 tank with a 115 millimeter gun. This was also very widely produced. Tens of thousands of these were produced. So once again, we were behind in the tank and tank gun competition, but things were about to get worse. In 1972, the Russians introduced the T-72 tank. This tank had a 125 millimeter gun, and it could fire projectiles like this one. This is called a long rod kinetic energy penetrator. And all it is, a great big metal arrow, this thing here, which is almost 3 feet long, which is fired out of this gun at incredible speeds, over a mile per second. And when this arrow hits an opposing tank, it penetrates just like an arrow does. Just because it is so fast and so heavy and so long, it can go through the armor of any tank that was out there at the time. So what could we do? We needed something new. The M60 simply wasn't going to do it. Well, we tried a couple of things. This is a picture drawing of an MBT-70 tank, which was our first response. So what this did was to try to achieve a low profile by putting all 3 men in the turret. But what that meant was that when the turret turned, the driver had to be counter-rotated so that he would be facing forward and not lose track of which way the tank was going. So what this actually wound up doing was making the driver sick most of the time. So in the years after the Vietnam War, funds were very scarce for new weapon programs. And so this was not a sufficient advance over the M60. So we needed something different. Now, fortunately, 3 things came together in the 70s. The first was a way to overcome the shape charge. So even small shape charges, such as this one. This is an RPG-7, and this is the internal aspect of the RPG-7. And the warhead includes a shape charge. And in one of our prior lectures, we went through shape charges, but they are truly a phenomenon of nature. So this down here depicts what happens when this explosive, this yellow part here, goes off and collapses this copper cone. The cone is squeezed together and forms a jet that can penetrate into this steel. And this just shows successive stages of penetration here, 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 and here. And then over here is an actual steel billet that was actually hit by a shape charge. And as you can see, even a relatively small shape charge, this is only not quite 3 inches across, and this has drilled about 15 inches into steel. So no tank of the day, not even the Russian tank, could defend against even these relatively small shape charges, much less larger anti-tank missiles. So fortunately, there was a development, mostly by the Germans and English, that was called Chobham armor or special armor. And the way that it works, it's a form of non-explosive reactive armor. So plates are put at an angle like this, and then there's a material in between that reacts when the jet hits it. You can see it forms kind of an explosion, or at least a propulsive event. And that throws these plates apart. But while they're doing that, they break up the shape charge jet. So for the first time, we had an armor that was capable of defeating shape charges. So this was a big deal. The next thing that happened was the development of a much better material, both for armor and for our own long rod projectiles. It's called depleted uranium. And we had tons of depleted uranium sitting around in great stockyards like this. That was the byproduct of nuclear reactors. And you can see there's casks and casks of this. Now, depleted uranium by itself is not a particularly strong or good material, but with intensive metallurgy, they were able to turn it into a very strong very tough, and especially very dense material. It has a density of over 19 grams per cubic centimeter, which is more than 2.5 times the density of steel. And density and strength are what make for a good long rod penetrator. So all of a sudden, we had great long rod penetrators that were actually superior to those of the Russians. So in conjunction with that, we designed the M1 tank to have a third innovation, and that is ammunition storage in a separate, safe ammunition compartment. So here's the ammunition up here in this bustle, they call it, at the rear of the tank. And that's protected from it's set off from the crew by these sliding doors that open when the loader needs to take ammunition out, but close as soon as he has. And then if a shape charge does manage to break through into this area, it's going to detonate the ammunition, but it has blowout panels on the top and on the sides so that the blast will vent through the top and sides, and it will not kill the occupants of the tank. So that was the third great innovation that was put into the M1. Initially, the M1, because we had the DU penetrators, we stuck with the 105 millimeter gun, the same gun that was on the M60. But as the implications of the 125 millimeter Russian gun began to sink into us, we realized that we needed a bigger gun. So the fourth innovation was the Germans had a 120 millimeter gun that we tested and found to be quite capable, and it was capable of firing the depleted uranium long rod ammunition that I just showed you. So in the M1A1, 120 millimeter gun was put on, and to counter the Russian long rods, depleted uranium plates were added to the armor of the M1A1. So this shows an M1, actually an M1A2, in an enhanced configuration that has additional armor here on the sides. And in the A2 version, a lot of electronics was added, such as GPS, map displays, electronic map displays, and situation awareness, and things like that. So that's what the M1 looks like today. So the U.S. is going to send 31 M1 tanks to Ukraine in 2024, not even this year. But they won't have the DU armor or the DU ammunition because it's too hard to clean up and because the composition of the armor is still secret. The main purpose of our agreeing to supply 31 tanks is to get Germany to authorize 100 or 200 tanks, not all of them their own, in this year, in 2023, hopefully in time for the anticipated spring offensive. But we need to realize that Russia already has over 1,000 tanks in Ukraine, and that anti-tank missiles and mines have continued development and have high effectiveness. And here, just for example, is a Russian tank that was hit by something, probably a javelin, and the ammunition blew up, and you can see that it completely blew the tank apart and killed all the people inside of it. And this has happened over 1,000 times in Ukraine. So 31 tanks in 2024 are not going to make a big difference to Ukraine. The 100 or 200 tanks that the Germans may send this year could have some effect, but they can't use them in a conventional manner. They can't use them simply to take on other tanks in big tank versus tank battles. Even if the armor on the German tanks stops the Russian rounds, the tanks will be damaged and they'll have to be taken out of the fight, because if you're hit by 125 millimeter projectile going a mile a second, it's like being run into by a car going 200 miles an hour, and your gun aiming isn't going to work. There's a good chance that your treads will be knocked off. That tank will have to be taken out of service and repaired, and repair will take a long time. So the Ukrainians will have to rely on different tactics, unconventional tactics for their tanks. They'll have to do hit and run raids on supply convoys and ammunition depots and quickly overrun some infantry formations. And they might be able to do blitzkrieg style deep strikes. Now, what would really be useful would be the most modern version of the M1, which has on it a system called Trophy that was developed by the Israelis, a little startup impetus by myself. And what Trophy does, it's on several hundred US tanks now, And Trophy has a radar that detects an incoming anti-tank missile, and then it tracks it to make sure that it is a missile and that it is aimed at this tank. If it is, then it shoots out a shotgun-style blast and knocks the missile down before it can impact and destroys the missile. So that would be the most useful thing that we could provide to Ukraine, but it's very unlikely that we're going to do so. So in sum, we can hope that the German tanks will make a difference this spring. The M1 tanks that won't get there until 2024, we can only hope that the war is already over by then. So that's it for the M1 and tank warfare.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you. My first impression is, looks like in the war, people are fighting by different type of ship chargers and anti-ship charger. So ship charger is the biggest principles and all kinds of weapons. That's my first impression.
Yes, the kinetic energy rounds can only be fired by tanks. There's no other gun system out there that fires those. So unless you have a tank, you can't use it. Furthermore, the kinetic energy rounds are really only useful against other tanks or against highly fortified positions, anything that requires a lot of power to go through. That's mostly not the case in Ukraine. Ukraine does have its own tanks, but not nearly as many as the Russians. So they have tried to avoid getting into tank-on-tank battles. And they should continue to avoid that because the Russians have way more tanks, and Russian tanks are good. The Russians made a design error. You remember how I showed you that the ammunition in the M1 tank is in a compartment that keeps the crew safe because if the ammunition detonates from a shaped charge hit, the blast is vented out the top. The Russians made a different decision. They put all of their ammunition down in the bottom of their tanks, reasoning that the bottom of the tank usually is not what gets hit because if there's any undulations in the terrain, the bullet can't hit the bottom. It can only hit the turret. But what they didn't reckon on was top attack systems like our Javelin that come down from above and that strike the tank and the jet goes through to the bottom. And that's what's caused so much of the catastrophic tank damage to Russian tanks in Ukraine. And we have
Exactly. I remember that when you talk about the Javelin, the principle of Javelin. That's amazing.
The Ukrainians should not try to use tanks in anything like that manner because the Russians have good anti-tank guided missiles as well. And in fact, they're proliferated around the world. The Palestinians have lots of anti-tank guided missiles, which is why the Israelis developed the Trophy system. Trophy is a game changer because if you can take out all of the shaped charge weapons, the RPGs, the anti-tank guided missiles, then the only thing that can kill you is either a mine, so you try to not go into minefields, and another tank. And our tanks are pretty well protected against Russian tanks. So you get a lot of tactical freedom if you have an active protection system on your tank. And going forward from this time, I would say that virtually any new tank design is going to have to incorporate active protection. It's too valuable. It's expensive. It's $1 million a copy, but it's worth it.
Okay. I really hope the war will end this year. Don't extend it to 2024. We want a peace talk.
Yes, I agree with you entirely, but the only way that I can see the war ending anytime soon is if someone replaces Putin.
I think the system, a country have its authoritarian tyranny type of structure. It's not only one dictator. It's like hundreds of thousands of dictators. That's a culture. Usually, I don't trust the idea of regime change war. But I think one way we build a very strong domestic economy, power. That's the biggest threat to those tyrannies. If American in a decline, especially we go to so many Marxism directions, that's the most dangerous thing that could bring to a war. I guess Russia probably is the same thing. If they saw we are going to decline and weak, they will have more Putin-like dictators came out. Even we get rid of one, there's another one. So the fundamental thing is strengthen our democracy and build our power on the domestic side.
Well, you're entirely correct about that. However, if Putin were replaced, you're right. He would just be replaced with another dictator. But the new dictator would almost certainly take a different approach regarding Ukraine, because the only reason why Putin would be replaced would be if the powers that be in Russia decide that he's causing too much damage to Russia and to themselves by his war in Ukraine. So if he were replaced through force, I would say it is almost certain that the war in Ukraine would at least be very different and would probably be ended.
I agree with his point. That's probably also the thing why so many people support continue the war. I just hold a different view, and let's see. And I hope the war will end in a better way, that least people die. Thank you very much for today's show recording.